I am going to step out of my comfort zone and do a short video sharing a piece of an aspect of my healing journey coming out of domestic violence, as you've seen through my posts, on and off really for several months. I've shared pieces, but there are pieces that I eliminate because they're very uncomfortable to talk about. There are pieces that still require healing along the way. But about 2 weekends ago, in a weekend away with some girls, unexpectedly, I was sharing my healing journey, what Christ has brought me through, how my heart has been healing, how I have been overcoming. And in that moment, I laid out some specifics that I realized those are parts that for some of the women, a few of the women there that I'm close to, that I realized I had not even shared with them, and withheld that. And they're close. They're an inner part of my circle. But in the beginning, few years of coming out of abuse, my pillars, my core people, they were people that I literally laid it out on the table. My spiritual parents, specifically, gut-wrenchingly were told every details that over a period of several years that I had hid and avoided conversation with them when they did try in previous encounters, when they just thought things were off, and I just would detour off track. I had come to the realization that this is the part of my ugly abuse story that I tend to ignore. Not really ignore on my part as far as healing, but ignore in sharing because it's very uncomfortable. It's very challenging for me to share, because it feels humiliating. It feels embarrassing. But it is a real aspect of abuse. When I share from coming out of domestic violence, I generally do not share somebody else's experiences. I am sharing my own personal experiences, my own personal journey. And that has always presented itself to be very hard for me. The first couple of years coming out, as I shared in a previous post, I chose not to defend myself against a lot of public things that my abuser and his family were doing. And I was encouraged to not respond. I was encouraged not to defend myself. I was encouraged to focus on healing. Probably for me, the reason why this part that I'm going to share about my abuse is not something I like to share is because it's really uncomfortable. It's embarrassing. It is beyond humiliating, and it is very hard for a woman to talk about. And it is something particularly amongst the Christian culture we do not talk about. Often we hide and enable abusers in the church. Sometimes abusers are ministers, and it happens that my abuser, his family, are ministers, and they would use often their power and position to hide and use it to humiliate. They used my family history that they gained knowledge of over the years because we were married, to weaponize against me in some things where I experienced childhood abuse, where I experienced sexual abuse as a young child. They also used physical ailments that I struggled with against me, and just use that to just pick and poke and just make me feel less than. And it was not something that happened right away. It was something that happened over little times, over long periods of time, because those that knew me before I met my spouse knew that I was a very strong, outgoing, very determined person. I knew what I wanted out of life. I knew what I wanted to do, and I was driven to get there. And people began to see that slow fade, and I did not. I did not see that I was losing myself until I woke up one day after a rage that he had had and realized, oh my God, what has my life come to? And this is where it gets really hard, is because a lot of people don't know that there is a such thing as sexual abuse and rape in marriage. And this is something I experienced. Every form of abuse was in my marriage, and not just from my spouse, but from his family. I want to take a few moments to explain some sexual abuse, because this is a real thing. The reality is 1 in 3 women are experiencing abuse. So 1 in 3 can be experiencing any level of abuse, if not all, some of the same abuses that I have experienced. And it is happening in the church. And there are unsafe ministers, and it needs to be dealt with. I find it interesting that this past year, I don't even remember how it crossed my path. I don't remember who introduced me. I don't remember the specifics, but there was something that was coming out about a well-known minister, and just a lot of immorality, a lot of things where he was victimizing people. And out of that came a huge awakening within the church about abuse and some topics for the first time I had seen churches starting to address, because this minister had a lot of sexual predatory behavior. And in that, there was a page that was created called A Voice for Victims. I ended up getting involved in that page and just kind of realizing there were aspects of my healing journey that I still needed to address. And the biggest one was the depth of abuse and sexual abuse that is so hidden, and something that I desperately clung to myself. I did not like to talk about it. I still don't like to talk about it. I want to share some forms of sexual abuse that I endured in my marriage, and things that were justified. And I'm telling you, it is never justified just because you're married to be raped or to experience a form of sexual abuse. Some of the ways that I experienced sexual abuse was to be forced to be intimate and give of myself when I physically was not well and in extreme levels of pain. Those that obviously have picked up on, I have significant issues with my ear. And a lot of times that would just provoke a lot of pain, and that was a constant problem and a constant area of pain for me. And if you're a person that struggles with chronic pain, if you're a person that struggles with pain and you know how exhausting fighting pain is, and because of issues with his addiction, with some prescription drugs as well as alcohol, there came a season I refused to take any pain medication for that reason. And so I would literally physically make myself endure physical pain and just try to suck it up and deal with it. And I had the dynamic that I've shared before, that they would tell me that my condition was made up. I was a hypochondriac, that nothing about my ear was real. It was made up pain for attention. And interestingly enough, when my abuser and his family has been out of my life for a period of now 6 years, I am probably now getting the best medical help for my ear that I have ever received, and more consistent. And I have learned in the last year and a half to be honest and reach out to my doctors and get that help that's needed and minimize my pain to the best that we can and minimize issues. But during times that I would have extreme pain with my ear, I was basically told if I didn't give of myself in that way, that if he went outside of our marriage, it was my fault. I was told that if I did not meet his needs in that way, that he would go elsewhere. And those who know the ins and outs of my story and different things that have happened, that is exactly what that man did. And then he would blame me. In that time, it was also discovered the level of his sexual addiction, of his handful of addictions that he struggled with or had or has, and never truly dealt with them. But his family, some of the ways that they would continue to perpetrate additional abuse is like his brother would say things like, I can think of 1,000 reasons why he would go elsewhere. I would hear things from his mother about how I just wasn't taking care of wifely duties. I wasn't good enough. She always said how she knew I was never good enough to be wife material, and that I could never meet expectations. There was just a constant blame me for those things. And over a period of years, I really began to believe that. I began to do things or give of myself in ways that felt humiliating, that felt dehumanizing in a lot of different ways. And it was really hard because I felt like, well, if I didn't do it, then it would be my fault if he went outside the marriage boundaries. And that was how he would comply. I remember after the birth of our first son, I ended up the week of Christmas in the emergency room in extreme pain. What I thought was back pain ended up being gallbladder issues, and it was very severe. And where they rushed me into emergency surgery, like it was still this day, it is something that I have still tried to wrap my head around how serious it ended up being. And it was really in that time, in that healing process, that he and his family would push me to physically go beyond what I felt I could physically. And in that time, while I was recovering and told not to do certain things by my doctor, yet my abusive spouse would make me do them. And I would be in excruciating pain. And so for some that don't ever seem to understand why I have this suck it up mentality, or this, it was literally conditioned and literally told that's the way my life had to be. And in doing that, I never felt I was allowed to say no to sexual demands in my marriage. I was told if I did not do it, it was my fault if he didn't stay faithful in the marriage. And I learned later, when I went to a center to help women for domestic violence, I learned that there was a such thing as rape in marriage. There was a such thing as sexual abuse in marriage. And I had never known that before, because it's not something we talk about. It's not something that we say, particularly in Christian culture, that says that is not okay. And it has been one of the hardest aspects of my abuse story to talk about, because it's humiliating. It's humiliating the extent of things that I would do to do what I could, because the reality was, no matter what I did, even if I said, I'll give of myself when I was in extreme pain, the reality was there was still no faithfulness, yet it was still blamed on me because it still wasn't good enough. And so I just want to encourage any woman out there that has experienced this and doesn't talk about it, I encourage you to seek help. I encourage you to learn who you are as a woman, to learn who you are, especially if you are a believer. Learn that you are a daughter of Christ first and foremost, and nobody has the right to do that to you. And that while on earth today, I don't know that I will ever see justice for any of the abuse I experienced from my abuser and his family. I know that they, particularly because they call themselves shepherds over people, they will be accountable to the one holy, righteous, just God. And that has been what has helped me realize I can grab on to my healing. That's helped me realize I can get through this. And it is one of the hardest parts of my coming out of abuse story that I struggle to tell. Because especially in Christian culture, we don't talk about this. We don't talk about abuse. We don't talk about the levels of abuse that happens in a home, in the churches. We don't talk about ministers that abuse their people. And one of the things that I am so grateful for is for the last decade, during my healing journey, God gave me an amazing community at the Rock of Roseville that absolutely enabled me 4 years after we started going there for me to just gradually open up. And it's because of them that I went to a community for peace and sought help. It was because of them that I sought a lot of the help that I sought. It's because of the community there that loved on me and said, Marsha, we know it's real. Marsha, we believe you. They wept with me. They sat with me. There wasn't a moment that they let my cupboards go empty. There wasn't a time that my children didn't have clothes. And that's a whole nother story of part of the abuse. There wasn't a time that my kids weren't blessed to go to an activity. There wasn't a time that I have ever felt alone in this journey, because where I previously was, I was alone, I was isolated, and I was shamed for even coming forward. And part of that is my spouse and his family coming from ministers. They knew how to play the minister card. They knew how to play this well. But when it was all out and revealed, I had the support I needed. Church, body of Christ. There are women out there. Yes, there's even men out there that get abused by women. There are children out there that need you to step up and be willing to talk about the ugly, disgusting, horrid truth of abuse. Abuse happens, it's real, and it's damaging. And I am telling you, aside from Christ, which most of you know is a huge part of my testimony, because I did almost walk away from my faith during this. But because God gave me an incredible community, a church that believed me, a church that stood with me, and a church that said abuse of any kind is not okay. I am a thriving single mother. Yes, I might still be legally married to my abuser, but they have never pushed me to go to steps that I didn't feel ready for because I didn't feel healed to. What they have done is supported me in that process. What they have done is made sure that myself and my kids are always taken care of. And I want to encourage church leaders that hear this message, church leaders that see this video. I encourage you to please address the topic of abuse in your church. Please address all forms of abuse. I am a woman that experienced every form of abuse in my marriage, and it wasn't just from my spouse, it was from his family. They were also a family of ministers that abused me. and they thought it was okay. And they always thought they could get away with it. And for the most part, they have. But the one thing that no longer they have control is to abuse me anymore. And they can't silence me anymore. And I want to encourage women, I want to encourage children, teens, anybody who's experiencing abuse. Speak up. Get help. Wherever you are, there are resources. There are people. If you don't know of any, which I've had many, reach out to me, private message me, and I will connect you with resources. Because I'm a firm believer in we must not be silent about this anymore. And one of those things which we don't talk about, particularly with abuse in church, is that sexual abuse and rape happens in a lot of domestic violence situations. And as hard and humiliating as it is for me to do this video, I did it because for too long, it's the one thing I have refused to really talk about, because it is the most shameful, embarrassing part of my abuse that I endured. Because there are times I still struggle with the fact that it happened and how it has tormented me at times. And so, if you are going through that, please get help.